everyone, good afternoon. I think we'll make a start now. There's still a few people logging in, but we'll try and start on time. If you can bear with me a little bit, we're using a different software technology today to do this webinar, which means that I can't see on the side of my little screen who's asking questions. So although you do have the ability to type in and ask questions your end, I won't actually be able to look at them until the end of the webinar. Otherwise, if I can see them on my screen, then you can all see them as well, and it sort of makes the presentation look a bit awkward having a box in the corner. So today we're going to have a little look at prescription writing, and essentially it's based around how we do things here at LBG Medical. And what we're going to cover today, so a little bit of an overview, essentially I want to talk through the way that we actually do things here at LBG in our lab specifically. But I also want to try and make some of it relevant. So at the end, we'll look at a case study, and we'll also look at a few examples as well as to why you might choose different prescription variables depending on the condition that you're treating. We'll also go through and discuss why you wouldn't do or why you wouldn't combine certain things on a prescription form and what those effects may be. But essentially, this whole presentation has been put together based on the questions that we commonly get in the lab regarding what to do on a prescription form or how to fill it out. So these are questions we get asked very, very often, and hopefully this presentation will answer a lot of those for you. So I'm going to start at the very, very beginning before we even get to the prescription form, and we're going to look a little bit, or just talk a little bit about casting. Now we accept pretty much all forms of casting, so there's plaster of Paris, foam impression boxes, 3D scanning, and slipper socks. There's also a fancy new gadget that you can get off Amazon that fits onto an iPad, and that will also do 3D scans, and there are a few clinicians out there who have been using that. I don't think it's quite there yet, and you do have to hold your iPad very, very steady, but it has worked for a few people. Normally, those 4 ones that we've listed there would be the most common. Now, they've all got their pros and cons, and people often say, you know, which is better? Is 3D scanning better? Is plaster of Paris better? But a lot of it is down to personal preference, and there isn't a lot of evidence as to why one might be better over another. So the first one on there, plaster of Paris, that's the traditional method. It's been used for years. It's actually the one that I prefer, but that's probably because I hate IT. But a good plaster of Paris cast will capture everything you need, and it's great for marking lesions on, adding plaster molds. The only thing is it does dry out, it can crack, and we can only store them for 6 months. So the other thing is it can be a little messy and time consuming. I guess the more you do, the quicker you become at that. From a patient perspective, some patients will think it looks a little old-fashioned and a bit archaic. So I suppose that could be a negative to it. The foam impression boxes, they're quick and simple, they're clean. You don't need to wash the patient's foot afterwards, but you do need to practice a little bit with them to begin with, just to get a good cast. Remember as well with the foam impression box, this is semi-weight bearing, so you're already going to capture some of the natural tissue expansion that you wouldn't necessarily get with a plaster of Paris suspension cast. Foam impression boxes are particularly good if you're casting children that won't sit still, because they're very quick to take, and you can just put their foot in quickly, bring it out again, and you've got a cast there straight away. Whereas plaster of Paris could be a bit tricky, especially with younger patients that don't necessarily understand what you're doing. Now 3D scans, and there's a little picture there on the side of my foot from a 3D scan. Now these have really come on a lot in the last few years, and they are a fantastic addition to a busy practice because they're quick to do. You don't have to mess about posting your casts or your foam impression boxes off. You don't have to store them in the bottom, you know, at the end of your clinic. You can also store all of those impressions that you take on your computer, and we can also store them here indefinitely. So if you want to repeat after 6 months, when we wouldn't normally have had your plaster of Paris cast anymore, we'll still have those impressions on record. So if later on down the line you want to order something like custom or prescription sandals for your patients, then you won't need to recast them. Slipper socks are also a good method, and you can take these either non-weight bearing or semi-weight bearing. It's quite a quick and clean method, but it does take a little bit of practice, and you do need to wear gloves, otherwise you'll spend days peeling the resin off your hands, and unfortunately, trust me on that, I do know. Now, the other thing we often get asked, and again you'll see it on the prescription form, is what the differences are between vacuum formed and direct milled. And the simple answer to that is it's the manufacturing process which is different. So a vacuum pressed manufacturing involves vacuum forming a sheet of heated thermoplastic over a positive cast. Now, this is the traditional method for orthosis manufacture, and it's been used for decades, and we've had excellent results using that. Many labs have had excellent results using that method. Now, it does mean that you have a little more autonomy over your prescription because each separate component of the orthotic can be easily modified. Another benefit is that you can use a large variety of materials, anything from EVA right through to carbon fibre, anything that's heat moldable. And because it's a handmade procedure, it means that your device is actually handmade, and that means a lot to some clinicians. The only thing with that is that repeatability may not be 100% accurate. So if you're ordering second and third pairs for a patient, it's not ever going to be 100% accurate. Very, very close to 100%, but it won't be 100% accurate each time. Now, direct milling uses CAD/CAM technology, and this is a process which is capable of producing very high quality orthoses with a higher level of accuracy than vacuum pressed. So you still need a knowledgeable, highly trained clinician for this, but their role is quite different. So instead of the hands-on approach that you might see with vacuum pressing, this manufacturing process requires a technician to design on orthotic on a computer screen, and then that device is milled out using a milling machine from a solid block of material. Excuse me, and this all happens as part of the computer program. So direct milling is very, very popular, particularly with your more computer-savvy clinicians. The accuracy is probably its best advantage, and it has a high repeatability. The other thing is the devices also tend to be very hard wearing because the heel post is all part of the product because it's been milled out of one solid block, and it's not glued on. So with a vacuum press device, we glue the heel post on separately. You know, in some rare occasions this does come adrift. Now, the main disadvantage with this device is that it's not quite so easy to amend. And also there's certain materials that you just can't use with direct milling, such as carbon fibre. So there's no right or wrong answer as to whether you would use direct milled or vacuum formed. It's basically a case of what you prefer to use or what your patient diagnosis is. So if I put that in brief, you'd probably choose vacuum pressed for most of your patients if you like a handmade device or you like to alter or modify a lot of your devices. And you'd more likely choose direct milled if you prefer using computer technology in your practice. And if you amend very few prescriptions and you order a lot of repeats. But that's a very sort of basic overview there. Now, we're going to have a little look at some of the different materials that we use. So first one here is carbon fibre. This is an excellent material. And that's because it has a very high resistance to crack, to impact, and to fatigue. It also doesn't creep like some of the plastics do, and it doesn't bottom out. It's got an unlimited shelf life. It looks great, and patients tend to like it because it reminds them of racing cars. But anyway, the only thing with this is that you can't use it for direct milled, and if you do grind it or make alterations in your own practice, then please make sure you don't breathe it in because it's not nice stuff. The dust that comes off is not great stuff to have in your lungs. So polypropylene is probably one of the most lightweight, versatile thermoplastics available. It's the most common shell material that we would use other than EVA. And it's heat moldable, it's flexible, it retains shape, it can creep or deform slightly over time, which of course carbon fibre doesn't. It's a very popular device, and there are different types of thermoplastic and polypropylene that we would use. Now, EVA is the most common material used, both for custom-made and prefab orthoses. And it's commonly used in orthoses, orthopedic, footwear industries, and has multiple uses because it comes in so many different densities, different thicknesses. It laminates very, very easily. We use a high specification EVA, and importantly, that's latex free. So if for whatever reason you've got patients who don't wear socks or they're allergic to latex, then that's not something you have to worry about with the EVA that we use. Now, most of you probably know this, but it's just a little reminder. The three main, we classify this into three densities, low density, medium density, and high density. So they're measured in shores. So a low density would be about an 18 to 25 shore. You typically use this for top covers or just shoe liners. Medium density would measure around about a 40 to a 55 shore. And you'd use that for all-round control for orthoses or minimum control, but obviously that depends on the patient's weight. And then high density comes in at a 55 to 65 shore, and you'd use that more for more rigid orthoses for heavier patients. Always use it for heel raises and posting on the back of our devices. Now, there are other materials available too. If you look at our little chart there, you've got polynylon, which gives quite a high level of control, higher than polypropylene, but just under carbon fibre. Another one on there is Toprel. This is very popular. Doesn't give as much control, but it's lightweight and it's great for shock attenuation. So it's really popular with some sports devices where you want that flexibility and you want the shock attenuation. It's also very popular when clinicians treat older patients, so maybe older ladies where they want a plasticky type shell, but they don't want the rigidity of some of the more controlling materials. Now, if you have a flick through our product catalogue, you'll see under each device there's a level slide at the bottom, and this gives you a little bit of an indication of how much control the material combinations in that device are offering. So it gives a bit more clarity for what you'd want to prescribe. And then on page 42, there's this shell material control spectrum, and it's got all the different materials we use on there, and it shows you how much control they'll give. So right at the very end, we've got carbon fibre, and then right at number 1 there, we've just got our simple insoles, which as you know, wouldn't give quite as much control. So let's have a little look at cast specifications, one of the first things we look at on the prescription form. Now, the arch profile refers to the amount of medial addition or medial expansion that you'd require on your device. Then lateral expansion refers to the amount of tissue spread that you want to allow, and the MOSI is a specific cast modification for a medially deviated subtalar joint axis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those. So looking at your arch fill, as a standard, we would normally add a 3mm medial addition, but you may want to alter this depending on your patient and their arch profile and what you're trying to achieve. So for example, if you had a patient with a supinated or pesicatous foot, you might want to maximize the total contact area of that orthotic. So by ticking no medial addition, you'd get a higher arch device, which would fit the profile of the arch more closely. And then on the other hand, if you selected a 6mm addition, you would get a much flatter profile, and this would look a little bit more like a root device. So no addition or a flatter device, or a more contoured arch profile you'd use for a caver's foot, or perhaps hard to control pronation. The standard 3mm, which is the first popular, it lowers the arch slightly, so you've got room for the foot to pronate on the device. Gives more gentle control. It's generally better tolerated with people. Sometimes the very high arch you get with no addition isn't always well tolerated. And then the 6mm addition offers less control, but then you get a lot less arch irritation. And this might be something you might use with older patients with maybe osteoarthritis or rigid flat foot or a tarsal coalition, or you might use this in combination with something like a MOSI or a Kirby Skive. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So next we've got lateral expansion, and our standard again is 3mm, but again you might want to alter this depending on whether you've got a particularly wide or a particularly narrow foot. You might also think about this depending on whether you've taken a non-weight bearing suspension cast or whether you've taken a semi-weight bearing cast, because if you've taken a semi-weight bearing cast, this will allow for a certain amount of tissue spread as the weight is applied. And it wouldn't necessarily be apparent on a non-weight bearing cast. So if you've got maybe a patient with very, very narrow feet, hardly any fatty padding around the heel at all, then you could quite easily go with a no addition on there. Standard 3mm is the most common. That fits the vast majority of patients. But then if you've got someone with a particularly wide foot, adult acquired flat foot, or even some of your Afro-Caribbean foot types that are very wide in the heel, then you might want to put a 6mm addition on there to allow for that extra tissue spread. Now, MOSI we get asked about quite a lot. This is a relatively sort of new addition that we've got to our prescription form. So MOSI stands, the MOSI stands for medial oblique shell inclination, and it's a specific cast modification which is for a medially deviated subtalar joint axis. Now, the problem with a medially deviated subtalar joint axis is that there isn't much room left on the medial side of the axis to add an antipronatory correction, which is what you're trying to achieve with an orthotic. So the MOSI is intended to create an incline on the orthotic shell, and so the entire medial side of the subtalar joint axis is basically lifted up, so you've got more force on there. So you do need to mark this on the cast when you send it off. Also with this, as I mentioned a little bit on the last slide or slide before, we would use a very low arch profile with this, because any arch support would either sit on the axis line or it would be the wrong side of it, and that would create a pronatory effect which we wouldn't want. Now, unfortunately, I haven't got a picture of this one here, but if you look at it, it just looks a lot higher on the medial side of the heel. Now, if you want more information on medially deviated axes, if you go onto our website at lbgmedical.com, look under the Education tab, and then look under videos or webinars. I think it's webinars actually. There is a webinar which we did a couple of years ago, which looks at the medially deviated axis, and it goes into a lot more detail, so how you'd find it, what the indications might be for it. So do look at that if you're unsure. So rear foot posting, we've got options. We can do medial or lateral, we can do extrinsic and intrinsic, we can add heel raises, we can add Kirby Skives on there. Now, when it comes to rear foot posting, as with many things with biomechanics, the research isn't brilliant in this area, and that means, you know, whether you'd have you post to be intrinsic or extrinsic. So there's not a huge amount of research which says that an extrinsic post is the best, but then, you know, that's research with you. You tend to find sometimes the more you look into research, the more you end up finding there isn't good evidence for what you're actually doing, but that's not to say that it doesn't work. And it is generally accepted, and it has been for years, that a hard extrinsic post will stabilise the heel during mid-stance, and it increases the surface area of the heel and increases the life of your orthosis. Now, obviously, if you've got shoe accommodation, which is a major issue for whatever reason, you probably wouldn't want to go with an extrinsic post because it might take up too much room in the shoe. So in that case, you might go with an intrinsic post instead. Now, lateral posting is less common, and a fair few clinicians just wouldn't go near this with a barge pole, but it does have its place. For conditions such as medial knee arthritis, lateral ankle sprains, rigid equinovarus deformities that you might see with certain neuromuscular diseases, this might be something that you would look to prescribe, but it's certainly not the norm. Now, there's actually a fair bit of evidence now for laterally posting an off-the-shelf device, but that's usually for medial knee arthritis. But I think that it does kind of depend on where the compensation is as to how effective that lateral posting would be. So the knee is a very complex joint, and mechanical loading in the knee won't always occur in the frontal plane. So if it's not occurring in the frontal plane of the knee, if that's not where the problem is, then laterally wedged devices tend to be less effective. But if the problem is in the frontal plane, and these are the sort of patients that might walk through your door with medial knee OA, and they've got like a genuvarum, and they walk in like John Wayne, and these sort of patients do tend to respond better to a laterally wedged orthosis. But anyway, if you're interested in that, there's lots of research looking into lateral posting, so look it up. It's certainly worth looking into and not completely writing off. Now, Kirby Skive is the famous innovation by Kevin Kirby, and basically, and I quote, it's the manipulation of ground reaction force to provide better control of the rear foot. So again, this is an excellent modification for an excessively pronated patient or a patient with a medially deviated subtalar joint axis. And this works really, really well for patients with conditions such as tibialis and posterior tendinopathy, and the paediatric flat foot. And I'll actually, my case study later talks about the paediatric flat foot. Basically, it's an area shaved off on the medial side of the cast. I don't know if you can see my arrow. So when we have the orthosis, you get like a flattened side there on the medial side. This is done in millimeters, and I think you can just about see it on the picture there. Oops. lost my mouse completely now. Yep, so just there. And it just creates more of a ground free action force to push up on the medial side of the calcaneus, on the medial side of the subtalar joint axis. But it's very, very popular, been used for a long time, and it's very, very effective. Get rid of the mouse. Now we're going to look at forefoot posting now, and there's quite a few things to consider with this. So first of all, it can be medial or lateral, extrinsic or intrinsic. And for a medial post or varus post, you might want to use this for something like a rigid forefoot varus. A lateral post or a valgus post you might use to stabilise something like a rigid cavoid foot. And there are some clinicians that think a lateral forefoot post also helps with things like a functional hallux limitus because it transfers the weight onto the first met. Now, there's quite a few considerations that you need to think about with forefoot posting, and this really centres around what effects it might be having elsewhere. So you really need to think about the flexibility of the shell. If it's too flexible and you've added an extrinsic forefoot post, the only effect this might have is just to dorsiflex the first ray, or you might end up supinating the midfoot because the shell flexes at this point. If you use a more rigid shell, then the antipronatory moment that you're putting in the forefoot is then transferred all the way back to the rear foot. So if that's what you're trying to achieve, you would definitely need a more rigid shell rather than something flexible or like an EVA. I'd also question how often you actually see a true forefoot varus. Most of the time it's soft tissue or soft tissue compensation or supinatus. So you might not want to support that with a rigid post. Also, you need to think about whether you're supporting or whether you're offloading or whether you're actually correcting. And it may be that you just want to essentially bring the ground up to meet the foot. So if you've got maybe an older patient with a fixed varus forefoot due to arthritic changes, if you've corrected the position of the rear foot, then it ends up bringing the forefoot off the ground and you can't, if you're in layman's terms, push it back down again. So in those cases, you might want an extrinsic medial forefoot post to bring the ground up to meet the foot to make that more comfortable. You also need to think about what you do to the cast. So if you add an intrinsic forefoot post, for example, and then you ask for the cast to be cut away at the first met or the first ray, it's not going to have the same function because you're basically taking that intrinsic posting out again. So as I say, you need to think about what you're doing overall rather than just sticking forefoot posting on there. So let's look at some other specifications that we can do and what we can alter. So we've got high medial flange, we can have lateral flanges, we can look at altering the pitch, we can alter the heel height, so if we've got limb length differences, and we can do first met cutouts, first ray cutouts, and we can also cut narrow if we want to reduce bulk. First ray cutouts aren't always so popular because it can make the medial side of the foot a little bit unstable. So I think first met cutouts tend to be more sort of popular. Now some of these you wouldn't necessarily do together, so you wouldn't have a high medial lateral flange and then ask to cut the device narrow, because these two things just wouldn't work together, because as you add the flange on there, it makes the device wider anyway. Also, the higher you go with the heel height, this would be more controlling for the foot, but it also makes your device wider and more bulky as well. So all of these things need to be considered if your prime objective is to reduce bulk. Now, a medial flange can be a very effective addition if you have a hard to control foot or if you have a lot of movement in the transverse plane. And if you think back to your anatomy of days, you think how the subtalar joint functions, it moves, it's triplanar and it moves in 3 planes. So it moves in the frontal plane, moves in the sagittal plane, and it moves in the transverse plane. So a good test for this is the navicular drift and drop test, because it gives you an idea of which plane most of the compensation is taking place in. Now, a rear foot post, simply putting, will address the frontal plane. An arch profile or supporting the substanticulum tali will address the sagittal plane, but the transverse plane is a lot harder to control, and that's really where your medial flanges can come in. But do remember, you will get a more bulky device with this, and it is more effective if your patient wears it with a walking style boot, because that helps to control the transverse plane movement as well. So, as I say, you need to make sure your patient's on board for the sort of device they're going to get if you prescribe a medial phalange, because it's just not going to go in a court shoe, a dress shoe, or a dog shoe. Lateral flange is very similar to what I've just described, but obviously it sits on the lateral side. And again, you'd need a good supportive ankle boot with this, but it does work very well for patients that have maybe had previous lateral ankle sprains, or they get a little bit of a lateral slide on their device, so they tend to slide off it. That can help sort of hold the foot in. Or for rigid rear foot, various deformities like a club foot, or certain things you might see with neuromuscular diseases. So to finish off your prescription, then there's lots of different modifications, extensions, forefoot padding additions that you could try. If you have a look on page 46 of the product catalogue, there's a few ideas, and there's a lot of pictures there as well, which can give you an idea of different things you can try. But again, it basically depends on what you're treating and what you're trying to achieve. But there's plenty there you can do to enhance your existing prescription. Now I've chosen just to look very basically here at hallux limitus, and I've got on the left hand side there first ray cutout, first neck cutout, and also a balance pad. Now you've probably noticed that with the padding, the different paddings that you can do, if you look in different books and read different papers, they all call different pads different things, and then name them after different people. So if you are in doubt, if you're sure about what you want, but you're in doubt about what to call it, then just draw a picture on the little feet on the bottom of the prescription form, and then give us a description with it. But as I say, the variations are plentiful with that. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a case study now, and some of you, if you've watched any of my presentations before, will have heard me speak of this one. But I think this is when I was quite a newly qualified podiatrist, and this is I think a very classic example of an orthotic prescription which went really quite wrong, and how I worked with that to get a good result. So this isn't the actual patient, but I got this image off of the internet, but it pretty much epitomizes what the patient's foot looked like when she came in. She was grossly excessively pronated. Now I didn't see her first off, she was seen by a colleague, but I ended up seeing her for a review. But she was a 12-year-old girl, and she'd been referred into the NHS podiatry department with the good old dare I say it, diagnosis there of excessive pronation, which of course isn't a diagnosis. But she'd previously been seen by a physio for knee pain, she had back pain, all sorts of foot pain as well, but she was essentially just referred into us because of her excessive pronation. Now the original prescription which was prescribed was a polypropylene shell, 8-degree rear foot posts, 4-degree forefoot posts, there was a valgus fill in there was a Kirby Skive, there was a high medial phalange. So to look at, it was a very, very aggressive prescription, but you could kind of see why all those things have been done, because she did have, as I say, a very excessively pronated, very mobile foot. So all these things were thought to help control it. Now the result of that was her orthoses were very, very uncomfortable. When she came back 6 weeks later, the knee pain was no better. She now had back pain as well, or more back pain than she'd had previously. She felt like she was walking on a big lump. She was getting metatarsal pain. So all in all, she was worse with the orthoses than she was without them. So I didn't really know where to start with this, so I phoned the lab, and they just basically took me through the reassessment. Now this is going back, gosh, 2003, 2004, so quite a few years ago. So it's before we'd come up with the MOSI way of doing things. And they asked about whether she had a medially deviated subtalar joint axis. Now at this point I didn't really, well, I'd heard of a medially deviated subtalar joint axis, but it was completely irrelevant, or I didn't understand what effect that might have on my patients. Anyway, she did, and basically what that meant was that most of the prescription on her, the original prescription, was causing the foot to pronate even further. And if I can go back to that, so your polyprop shell is okay, your 8-degree rear foot posts are okay, but forefoot posts, because that's crossing the axis line, it's just going to push the foot the wrong way. The valgus fill is going to push the foot the wrong way. The Kirby Skive would be correct, and the high medial flange, it would depend entirely on where the axis was lying. But essentially what was happening was that part of the prescription was correcting her excessive pronation, and the other part of the prescription was forcing it into further pronation, and that was having quite an effect around her mid-tarsal joint and just basically making the whole thing uncomfortable. It could also explain why she was getting back pain and compensations, but it would almost certainly explain why she was getting the pain in the midfoot. So together with the lab, we actually it was RX Labs at the time, which is now part of LBG Medical. And somebody asked me the other day if RX Labs still exist, and it does, and we do them now. So take two, on the next prescription we did, we just had a Kirby Skive. We had a high medial flange still because when I reassessed her, that didn't interfere with where her subtalar joint axis lay. This time we had a 6-degree rear foot medial post, and we had a 6 mm arch fill. So basically the arch was pretty flat, so there was nothing pushing up on that axis line. So she tried these, came back 6 weeks later, and everything was much improved. She also had stretching exercises and strengthening exercises with the physio, but this prescription was a lot better because we really took a lot more notice of what was going on with her foot. So it's quite a good example of, if your orthoses don't work the first time, think about what you've prescribed, what could have gone wrong, or what effect your prescription is actually having on that particular patient. So most of the time, 99% of the time, you can work through it and get a very good result. Now, I've just added a couple of extra little examples here, which I've taken, or the illustrations I've taken from Kevin Kirby. So these are just a suggested rationale to prescribing if you follow a tissue stress approach to your assessment. And it's quite a good way of doing it, really, because it makes you think about what you're trying to achieve rather than just getting fixated on stopping pronation. So I've picked good old favourite here that a lot of us see quite often, the plantar fasciitis or plantar fasciosis, whatever you want to call it. So if you think about the stresses which are occurring with a plantar fasciitis, you've got a tensile force on the plantar fascia, so a tensile pulling as that plantar fascia stretches, and you've also got a compressive force which comes from the ground reaction force as their heel hits the ground. So these are the two things that we want to address, and these are the ways that you could do it with a prescription. So you might look for, you might want to do deep heel cups on there to try and control the rear foot. You'd also have a medial rear foot post to hold the calcaneus in a better position and reduce that tensile force on the plantar fascia. You'd likely want a 3 mm arch fill because it would give some support under the sustenticulatum tali, but it wouldn't be too much, so it wouldn't impinge on the plantar fascia. And then to address the compressive force from the ground reaction force, you could add a heel cushion or something we do which is called a heel punch with a fill, and that's when we actually make a hole in the bottom of our orthosis here, and we plug that with a soft material, so you've got softer cushioning as they impact on the ground. You have to be a little bit careful with Kirby Skives, because if the irritation in their heel is more on the medial side, then the hardness, if you like, or the inclination of the Kirby Skive might press more on that insertion of the plantar fascia. So it's not to say that this is exactly what you have to do every time you get a patient with plantar fasciitis, but it's an idea of how to break things down and how to approach it. And another common thing we tend to see is tib post tendonitis. So the main stress we're addressing here is we've got an increased tensile force on the tib post tendon. So if you think about it, the tib post tendon is one of the main inverters of the foot. So if the foot's going into excessive pronation, it's going to put a lot of pull on that tib post. So the things we could think about for a prescription would be a Kirby Skive or indeed a Mosai. We could have a medial rear foot post, minimal arch fill if your patient has got a medially deviated subtalar joint axis, which they often do with this particular type of foot type. We'll have a deep heel cup to basically hold it all in place, possibly a flange, and we want to use a stiff material, because with these foot types, if you used anything like a medium density EVA, even a hard density EVA, or something like Toprel, the material just isn't going to be stiff enough to hold the prescription that you're putting in. Now, just before I draw to a conclusion, I'll just show you this table on here, and this is our table of defaults. So if you don't, for whatever reason, specify otherwise on your prescription form, this is what we will do. Now, if you want to look at it in more depth, you can re-watch this video again later, and you can pause the slide, and you can take down notes, or you can give our lab a ring and just ask us to email you the defaults over. Now, take note that the defaults aren't necessarily the same between vacuum formed and direct milled, and this is mainly because of the manufacturing processes. So, for example, and this is one we get asked quite a lot, if you look at the down the bottom of the list, the front trim line, so the distal edge of your orthotic, if you've got a vacuum formed device, will cut it straight. If it's direct milled, it comes in that nice sort of rounded parabola. So they are the standard variables. Now, if you wanted to work a certain way, or you prefer a different prescription, or maybe you want a parabola on your vacuum formed devices, then you can set your own personal set of defaults, which are bespoke to you, and then we'll do that every time unless you say otherwise, and with the devices that you send in. So if you want to do this, contact our evaluation team or have a chat with one of your sales reps. But we can certainly set this up for you so you've got your own personalised set of defaults for what you tend to do. So I guess to bring it all to a conclusion, I think the main thing with prescription writing is that you understand the mechanics behind the pathology that you are trying to treat. Now, we haven't really covered this side of things in this webinar, but if you go and you look onto our website, like I said before, lbgmedical.com, look under education, there's lots of videos on there and other webinars which look at specific conditions. Also the role of orthoses and tissue stress approach and many more. And if you start to watch those, you can get much more understanding about how you might direct some of your prescriptions. Now, you also need to consider your patient's specific needs. So if you're treating someone like a professional footballer, you wouldn't necessarily make a bulky device for them with a high medial phalange, even though you might think it's good for him. So it's always very important to consider that as well. It's also important not to always do the same thing. So there's lots of other things like material flexibility or cast modifications, forefoot adaptations, and you can tailor these for your patient for better outcomes. And if you think about that and take all those things into consideration, then your patient's going to be a lot happier as well, and you tend to get a lot less returns. So at the end of the day, that's why we call it a custom-made orthosis, because you've got the flexibility to make all these different adaptations. So, any questions? That's if I can find my questions, which are hidden somewhere at the bottom of this webinar. Don't forget, you can also email our evaluation team. You can also ask our reps. We'll be able to answer some more questions for you. Well, this is the bit where I discovered that all the way through this webinar, I haven't had my microphone turned on. Right, somebody's put, is that like a Kirby Skive? Is what like a Kirby Skive? If you're referring to the Mosai, then kind of, but the Mosai looks a lot more aggressive. You can, whereas the Kirby Skive, you have to sort of really look at the heel of the shell to see you've got a flattened bit in there. The Mosai, as I say, looks a lot more aggressive. You can really see that adaptation on the medial side of the device. Oh, that's it. Okay, so somebody's asking on the pediatric flexible flat foot case study that I talked about, which material did I make from the device, EVA or polyprop? I used polyprop, and that was because, I mean, if I'd have done a supination resistant test on her, I probably wouldn't have got my 2 fingers underneath the navicular. She's very, very heavily pronating, and an EVA just wouldn't have cut it, basically. It just wouldn't have supported her, so yeah, it's polyprop. Ah, it's interesting. Somebody's put, would you ever consider a Mosai with a lateral rear foot post? And that gentleman said, I've seen one. Yes, I mean, it wouldn't be the norm. It all comes down to what you're trying to achieve. I'm guessing if someone's put a lateral rear foot post on, they may be trying to address medial knee arthritis, but they're not wanting to sort of mess up the internal mechanics on the medial side of the foot. So I guess if you put a Mosai in there, in very basic terms, you're holding the medial foot in place, but you're posting the rear foot, and then therefore the lower leg over laterally, which would open up the medial joint space on the knee. That would be my guess as to why somebody may have prescribed that, but it's certainly not something particularly common, and I don't know how well a patient would tolerate that. But yeah, interesting combination. There's no reason why you couldn't do it. Got any more questions for now? So say this might be something where you want to re-watch the video again afterwards and jot down questions, and then you can always ask us. Or sometimes questions don't crop up until you've got a patient in front of you, or you know you've got a patient coming in. I think as well, and this is, I've had a few phone calls about this. Sometimes clinicians will have somebody booked in and they'll give us a ring first just to ask for advice. So we're happy to help with that. Okay, can you just describe the MOSI one more time? So basically, if you've got a patient with a medially deviated subtalar joint axis, essentially the whole shell is inclined upwards on the medial side. I think probably best, Michael, if you want to drop me an email, I'll get a picture of one sent to you and you can have a look. I should have had a picture really for this presentation. But yes, basically it's just adding maximum control to the whole medial side of the subtalar joint axis, which is the only area that you can put control on if your axis is medially deviated. Could I Google it while I'm screen sharing? I could, but goodness only knows what I'll come up with. As I said earlier, and this is the whole reason why I do plaster Paris casts, I'm not particularly IT savvy. I'd hate to start screen sharing and come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So yeah, drop me an email. It's heidi@lbgmedical.com, and I'll find a picture and I'll email it to you. Or actually, maybe I'll write a blog on it within the next few weeks or something to make it clearer, because I think the people that do use this use it very, very effectively and very, very well. The people that don't use it just don't know what it looks like or don't know how to use it. So. Great presentation. Thanks, Jose. And then Martin, you've asked what's the difference between a 20-degree MOSI and a 5mm Kirby. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't know. I mean, they're just different ways of doing it. I think you get more control with the 20-degree MOSI than a 5mm Kirby, but again, it depends on your patient. I mean, the main thing with the MOSI is it just comes up higher, as I say, on the medial side than a device which has got a Kirby Skive built in, and it's in a slightly different area. But what the actual difference is in degrees or mils, I wouldn't know off the top of my head, and I think that would depend on your patient. Right, somebody said, where will I be able to access the video? You'll get an email shortly just saying thank you for watching the webinar, or if you want to re-watch it, then there'll be a link on there. And then we post it on our website, usually a few days later, but certainly by next week. If you go on our website under education, then this will be with all the other webinars, so you'll be able to access it and watch it as many times as you like. Might also be handy if you've got new clinicians joining your practice to get them to watch it, especially if you're using us regularly for your custom-made devices. A lot of the time, I think when people have issues with devices coming back, it's something we can rectify just by looking into how the prescription's been carried out. So it's yeah. And then Jose's asked, in your opinion, you recommend a heel raise and almost all patients? No, I mean, you're always going to get a little bit of a heel raise anyway if you put an external rear foot post on there, but it should be fairly minimal, and you'd have it pretty much the same on each side. There's different arguments for heel raises, because if you think about sagittal plane theory, if you put a heel raise on, then you're starting that first ankle rocker. So if you think about the 3 rockers with sagittal plane theory or Dannenberg's theory, you've got the 3 rockers, so anything you do to aid those will help move your patient from heel contact into mid stance and then toe off. So there is a thought that if you put heel raises on, that will help with that. But then you've also got to think about what happens with soft tissue contractures with that as well. And if you're always putting heel raises on, you're likely to get a shortness or a little bit of contraction maybe in the backs of your legs and your calves. So depends what you're treating. And if you've got someone who's got more of a fixed range of motion, which isn't soft tissue in the ankle joint, so they've got less flexibility there, then a heel raise will help. But you want to make that bilateral so you don't cause any inconsistency on both sides, on either side rather. So you want to keep both things the same. The other thing where heel raises help, and as I say, a heel raise on both sides you do it for, is if you get patients, maybe you're at-risk patients that tend to overload underneath the metatarsal area. So they might be getting something as simple as just use the blanket umbrella term of metatarsalgia, but it could be capsulitis, a stress fracture, or even a diabetic patient who's breaking down in that area. If they're getting the problems there because they're spending too long on the mid-tarsal joints, and if you put heel raises in, then it will move you off mid-tarsal joints quicker, because you're speeding up the process from landing on the heel through to toe off. So that's when you might use heel raises, but I wouldn't necessarily use them on everyone at all. Starting to lose my voice now. Yeah, so does that answer your question, Jose? So yeah, I wouldn't use them in all patients, but I certainly would consider them in some patients. And so heel raises aren't just stick on one side when someone's got a limb length difference. You can use them bilaterally on both sides to think about speeding up or altering the way that foot functions. And then also you've got things like Achilles tendinopathy, where you might want to put heel raises on just to take slack off the Achilles tendon while you start slowly prescribing loading exercises. The other thing with heel raises is it's going to lift you up higher in the shoe. So it might be great for the way you're making the foot function, but then if it causes the back of the heel to irritate or the patient won't wear them, then these are other things to consider as well. I think ideally we get all patients wearing nice, well-supportive walking boots that come up to the ankle, but it's unlikely. I think we're going to talk them into doing that. Oh, excuse me. It's always tricky doing these webinars, and I've said it many times before, because I'm just looking at the screen and looking out the window, and I'm doing all the talking. There's normally these audience questions would come up as we're going along. Sam, you can get lost. Who's going to win the 12:55 at Warwick? I don't know if you're talking about horse racing or football. I'm a girl. I don't understand these things. Or maybe you watch sumo wrestling. I don't know. Any more questions for now? I can't see on here who's still logged on. Right, okay, I'm going to log off now. If you do have any questions, do feel free to email me. Oh, there's another one coming here. Question mark. Crikey. Oh, thank you, Jose, for your kind comments. Right, okay, now Martin's just asked me, assuming the Mosai and the Kirby are the same in the frontal view, are they different in the cross section? Yes, because if you look at them from the sagittal perspective, yeah, they would look different in the cross section. I think the best thing I can do, Martin, is email you some pictures. Mind you, you've seen a Mosai, haven't you? I mean, essentially, it's just a different way of doing it. The Kirby Skive has been around for years and years and years, and the Mosai is a relatively new thing which developed. So, as I said, when I gave you that, when I did my case study, which was back in 2003, and the Mosai hadn't even been developed then, so that, I mean, it's something I might consider now with a paediatric flexible flat foot. But I certainly wouldn't have done then because it just wasn't about to do. Whereas the Kirby Skive is sort of the old tried and tested, which has been used for many years. Right, okay, I think I'm going to draw it to a close now. As I said, do watch this again when it comes up on our website. You'll be sent a reminder for this. And do feel free, as I say, to email in with any further questions. Okay, right, thanks everyone for watching.